Hey guys, Nietzsche, I want to talk about Nietzsche today and just give kind of an introduction and overview of his life very briefly, and then in future videos we'll look at some of his writings. Nietzsche was born on October the 15th in 1844 in a village in Prussia. In Prussia, his father, his uncle, and his grandfathers were all Lutheran ministers, so he was raised in that environment. But his father died of a brain tumor when he was only 5, and after that, his 2-year-old brother would die 6 months later. So from then on, he lived with just his mother, his grandmother, his sister, and 2 maiden aunts. So he was surrounded by women when he was growing up, and that must have had some kind of impact on him and in his later views towards women, which aren't that gracious. So anyway, then he originally studied with the intent of joining the clergy, but then switched to study philology, and he was very intelligent. He was very good. He did well in his studies. When he was 21, he discovered Kant, and also, which was even more important for the direction he would take, he stumbled across Schopenhauer's recently published "The World as Will and Representation," and he loved that. That started him off really in philosophy, and he wrote a one of the third of his untimely meditations was on Schopenhauer as educator, and it's in it he just praises Schopenhauer for his thought, and I think what he really liked about it was the Schopenhauer kind of went against the trend at the time, which was rationalization. Everything was reason and order, and Schopenhauer went the other direction um, and placed the irrational will, above that, and you can see that in Nietzsche's philosophy as well. Although he does break with Schopenhauer later on, his philosophy takes a different path. He always has that in common with Schopenhauer, that focus on this irrational, striving will instead of a reason which creates order, and which organizes and keeps things nice and neat. Their will is more fundamental for both of them. So then when he was 23, he entered his military service, mandatory military service, but then the next year suffered a chest injury which refused to heal, and he was discharged. He went back to university where he met Richard Wagner, and those two became close friends. He respected Wagner for his musical genius, which Nietzsche apparently played the piano very well as also, and so they had that connection, and they became really good friends, and that's a defining friendship that Nietzsche had there. And his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, was published in 1972, and that was heavily endorsed by Richard Wagner and Nietzsche in that book. No, not in that book, but Nietzsche had also said a lot of good things about Wagner, and unfortunately, though, his book was scathingly criticized by an influential philology scholar, and Nietzsche also, in his later works, he has a very dim impression of scholars and academia, and it's not hard to kind of draw those connections or link his ideas back to these kind of experiences. Yeah, when he was just roundly criticized by this guy. So then in 1876, Wagner's masterpiece, The Ring of the Nibelung, was performed, and Nietzsche attended, but already at that time, tensions were starting to form between the two over the kind of cult following that Wagner had. And there were some other problems. Wagner was anti-Semitic. He was hostile towards the French, and he was very nationalistic in his Prussian, I guess, in his Prussianism, and none of those things apply to Nietzsche. Nietzsche wouldn't have been on board with any of those. And when he learned of Wagner's next project, which was Parsifal, and that it would advance Christian themes, it's not hard to imagine that was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. And they shortly after that, they wouldn't meet each other anymore. They would kind of split, and yeah, again, but a really foundational relationship, or formative relationship, that he had. He would resign from his post at the University of Basel in 1879 due to poor health, and he was very sick. Nietzsche was a really, his body was just out to get him, really. He would have migraines. He had a really weak digestion, so he'd have to eat very carefully, very plain food, and very small amounts. And he'd also have to take a lot of medicine, and then he'd have to take other medicine to counter the side effects of that medicine. And he had problems with his eyesight. Yeah, he was just a mess, and it just only got worse. And during the 80s, when he was in his writing frenzy, he was almost I mean, he could write for like in a kind of mad state for like 6 hours, and then but he'd be hunched over, because his eyesight was so bad he could barely see what he's writing. He'd be frantically writing, and then because he knew after a few hours he'd be bedridden for hours or days. I'm not sure, but for a long time. So yeah, that was his physical condition, just not good at all. So if you think you've got it bad, keep that in mind. And since he had given up his Prussian citizenship and failed to acquire a Swiss one, he didn't belong to any state. He was stateless. So for the next 10 years, through the 80s, he travelled as a wanderer, drifting between Swiss, French, German, and Italian cities, never staying in any one place for more than a few months. But during this period, and despite, like I said, his debilitating health problems, he would publish 9 books, and those are the books that we all know Nietzsche for. He also met in 1882, when he was 37 years old. He met and fell in love with a woman called Lou von Salom. Probably not pronouncing that right, but she was a 21-year-old Russian student of philosophy and theology. He proposed to her, but she rejected his marriage proposal, and then left for Berlin with a friend of his, of Nietzsche's, which again can only have had a negative impact on his attitude towards women, which we'll talk about more when we look at some of his writings. And finally, in January 1889, he suffered a mental breakdown and basically went insane. and for the last 10 years of his life, he died in 1900, but for the last 10 years he was essentially insane. But he was living with his sister Elizabeth at that time when he died. So that's Nietzsche in a nutshell. And just a couple of other points to make, though, that Nietzsche, I think, is often misrepresented. There are a couple of different ways. First of all, he's not promoting anarchy, although it often can kind of seem like he might be. He's not anarchic. He is elitist, that's for sure, but he's not promoting anarchy. He's not saying we should, have no state. We should all run our own lives. He is for order and control, but it's kind of a top-down authoritarian kind of regime more than not anarchy at all. He's also not nihilistic, and this is one that a lot of people think he's like the poster boy for nihilism, but that is just not true. He comes across as nihilistic because he rejects all values, and he wants to go beyond good and evil, right? He wants, which some people interpret as him as being, there is no good and evil, and in a sense that's true, but it's not nihilism. It's relativism that he's promoting. So he's for a certain set of values, but they're values that he's made, and he wants everybody to create their own value system. So he doesn't want to. He doesn't think values should come from the top down. You should create your own values, or at least the leaders, the great people at the top, create their own values. That's what makes them great. And but it's not that there are no values. There are no absolute values. There are no transcendental values. We always make those values, whatever they are. So they're not absolute. So he's not nihilistic, although he is a relativist, I would say. He's also not anti-Semitic, and that's another thing that he often gets falsely characterized as. He says as much. He says that anti-Semitism is it's a form of resentment towards Jews, and and when we get into Nietzsche a little bit later, we'll see resentment is a negative, kind of weak, pathetic reaction. It's a despicable response to something. It's not a noble, strong affirming of anything. It's the exact opposite of that. It's life denying. It's a negative reaction, which he's not interested in, and so he calls anti-Semites victims of resentment, and he also explicitly says that the Jews are as a race, as a culture, they are commendable. He doesn't like Christianity, and he doesn't like the Judaism, I guess we could say, but he doesn't have any problem with Jews themselves, and he says words to that effect many times. So he's definitely not anti-Semitic. And another thing that he gets linked in with is Nazism, and it's true that Hitler did adopt Nietzsche as his go-to guy, if you like. But that's hardly Nietzsche's fault, and it's only really on a misinterpreted version of Nietzsche, because there's nothing fascist about Nietzsche at all either. So hopefully some of these things will come up. Just on that point, how he's come to be associated so closely with Nazism is his sister Elizabeth. She is quite heavily responsible for that. The last book published about Nietzsche, it was published from his notes, but his sister Elizabeth collated them and made this book, The Will to Power. And she was anti-Semitic, and her husband was anti-Semitic, and Nietzsche didn't like either of them because of that. But so she collated and put this book together and published it, and it really misrepresents and misinterprets in the worst way possible what Nietzsche had to say, you know. And then from there, it just, he just became the poster boy for the far right, basically, which he would have found appalling, I think. So anyway, there's that. However, he is very controversial, and a lot of what he says is jarring, and it was designed to be, I think, but that's not an excuse for some of his positions. He does hold, like I said, he is elitist. He does think that the great men, and it usually is men at the top, ought to make their own values, and they're not beholden to anybody or anything or any standards because they make the standards. So he does have very, like I say, controversial ideas, and I don't think I'm fully on board with him, but there are parts of Nietzsche that I like. There are certain aspects to Nietzsche that I can fully get behind, but just not all of it. Not as much, say, as like Sartre or Heidegger. But yeah, and he also writes very. He doesn't write solid essays. Well, he does write some, but a lot of his writing is ambiguous. It requires interpretation, and especially like the first book I'll be looking at, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. That's very poetic and lots of imagery, and there are even songs in there. He's written songs. So it all needs interpretation, and I'm probably not the best person to do that. It's not really my strength. I like just give me the facts, just break it down and tell me what you think. But that wasn't Nietzsche's project, and he had his own reasons for that. But it's not my strength. It's not my forte. I think interpreting these kind of the style of writing, but I'm going to give it a go because it is interesting, and hopefully someone will get something from it. And like I say, if there is anything you disagree with, by all means put it in the notes. And I'm certain that I won't cover everything. Just about, every sentence of Nietzsche, you can have a whole paragraph explaining it. So there's going to be plenty of stuff to talk about, and what I will cover is just kind of what I've picked up, or what I imagine he's trying to convey. So with that caveat in mind, next video we'll start with Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you shortly.